In ancient Rome, a virgin could be sold for 20 silver coins. If she was wounded, the price dropped to 10. This wasn't a myth. It was recorded on stone tablets. But who truly paid for Rome's empire? The chronicles glorify emperors and battles, but the real price was paid by those whose names were erased, whose suffering built the empire. Archaeology, legal records, and forgotten bones are telling the untold story. If you value the truth of history, subscribe, because when the ledger closes, the bones still speak. Imagine the grandeur of ancient Rome, its colossal architecture, its legions marching in unison, its emperors glorified in history. But beneath this splendor lies a grim truth that history has long ignored. Rome's empire wasn't built on gold or glory. It was built on bodies, the bodies of the enslaved. These were people who had no freedom, no identity, no claim to their own lives. The enslaved were treated as property, traded, sold, and disposed of at the whim of their masters. Theirs was not a life of purpose or even survival. It was a life of labor and sacrifice to fuel the empire's endless thirst for expansion and power. The question must be asked, who truly paid for the rise of Rome? It wasn't the emperors, whose victories were chronicled in marble and scrolls. It wasn't the legions whose battles brought Rome's dominion to distant lands. The true cost was paid by those whose names never made it into the annals of history, the enslaved. Their labor, their pain, their lives were consumed in silence to ensure the empire thrived. Their stories were erased by the very system that benefited from their suffering. Whether in the mines of Spain, the fields of Egypt, or the gladiator arenas in Rome, the enslaved were the foundation on which Rome's glory was built. Their lives were not their own. Their bodies were tools to build aqueducts, clear land, and fight wars, all for the perpetuation of Rome's grandeur. The cost was brutal and unimaginable: harsh labor, constant surveillance, and for many, death before their time. But despite the brutality, their stories have survived. Archaeological discoveries, legal records, and even their bones have begun to tell us what the chronicles refused to acknowledge. These people, whose lives were deemed expendable, are now speaking from the past, reminding us of the true price of empire. Who truly paid for Rome's glory? The official records tell one story, but when we listen to the bones, when we read the ledgers, the truth is far darker than we've been told. The first rays of dawn break across the empire. In the quiet before the city fully awakens, the enslaved are already moving. They have no choice. Their days are dictated by the whims of their masters, and the clock of their lives starts ticking long before the sun rises. The sound of chains clinking, the rustling of tattered clothes, and the sharp crack of a whip are the first signs of life for those enslaved in ancient Rome. This is the moment when millions of lives are molded into the grinding gears of an empire. Their names are never recorded in the annals of history, their faces rarely seen beyond the shadows of their labor. Yet, it is through their toil that Rome grows. It is through their sweat and blood that the empire's temples rise, its roads stretch across continents, and its legions march in triumph. These people, stripped of their humanity, begin their days long before their masters ever stir. Their existence is one of constant surveillance, brutal punishment, and ceaseless work. But it is also a life with few reprieves. Their labor is the heartbeat of the empire, their suffering the cost of its magnificence. For the enslaved, there is no grace. The master's house is their world, whether in the dark, smoke-filled kitchens of the elite or the sun-scorched fields of the provinces. They are bound to the land, to the task, to the empire. From the moment their eyes open, they are already in service. They have no family, no leisure, and no voice. Their only purpose is to work and survive the unrelenting demands of Rome. As the sun peaks over the horizon, the enslaved begin their duties. Some will rise to tend to the fires of their masters' kitchens, preparing breakfast for those who will feast. Others will be sent to the fields to harvest crops that sustain the empire's growing population. Still, others will be forced into the mines, their hands bleeding as they extract the gold, silver, and iron that line the pockets of Rome's ruling class. Every task is grueling, every moment laden with the threat of punishment. The enslaved are given no reprieve, no time for themselves. Their bodies are mere tools to be used until they break. The overseer's lash is never far away. The fear of it hangs over every action, every breath. The first signs of resistance, small gestures of defiance, are met with swift retribution. A momentary delay in work, a glance away from the task at hand, a quiet prayer whispered under the breath. Each small act of rebellion is crushed, often brutally. The enslaved have learned to live in fear, for even the smallest mistake can cost them their lives. For those enslaved, the labor is as varied as it is brutal. In the cities, they are put to work in workshops, grinding out the tools and luxuries that Romans take for granted. In the fields, they toil under the hot sun, their backs breaking as they plow the earth, harvest grain, and care for the livestock that feed the empire. In the mines, they dig deep into the earth, their lungs filled with dust as they unearth the precious metals that will become the currency of empire. The work is not just physical, it is emotional and mental as well. In many ways, the enslaved are not just workers, they are property. They have no rights, no recourse to law. They cannot escape, for to run away is to risk being branded as a fugitive, to be hunted and punished. In the Roman system, their bodies belong to their masters, and the law supports this ownership. Roman legal codes like the Lex Fufia Caninia and the Lex Aelia Sentia ensure that enslaved individuals are not treated as human beings, but as possessions, to be bought, sold, and disposed of at will. The life of the enslaved is marked by scarcity. Their food is meager, often nothing more than stale bread, porridge, or scraps of meat that the masters throw away. Their clothing is torn, patched, and ill-fitting, designed not for comfort, but for utility. They sleep in cramped, unsanitary quarters, often sharing a space with dozens of others. Disease runs rampant, and the mortality rate among the enslaved is high. Those who survive the work, the neglect, and the disease are often scarred for life, their bodies worn down before their time. Yet, despite this harsh existence, there is an eerie sense of survival. The enslaved endure, day after day, year after year. They form small communities, bonds forged in suffering and shared hardship. They whisper words of resistance to one another in the quiet of the night, always aware that to be caught is to face the wrath of the masters. Some enslaved people find solace in religion, in small acts of resistance, in fleeting moments of connection with one another. But these moments are few and far between. The system of Roman slavery is designed to strip them of their humanity, to break their spirit and keep them under control. And yet, despite the odds, the enslaved continue to live, to work, and to dream of a life beyond the chains that bind them. The price for defying this system is high. Acts of rebellion, no matter how small, are met with the most extreme punishments. If an enslaved person attempts to escape, the penalty is brutal, often resulting in crucifixion, branding, or forced labor in the mines. The Roman state doesn't just punish acts of defiance, it uses them as a public lesson for others. The crucifixion of runaway slaves is a spectacle meant to instill fear and maintain control over the rest. Even subtle acts of resistance are punished severely. A slave who speaks out, who looks their master in the eye, or who refuses to submit in some way, will be beaten, humiliated, and perhaps even killed. The Roman legal system, designed to maintain order and preserve the power of the ruling elite, treats rebellion as a crime of the highest order. Slavery in Rome is not just a physical condition, it is a legal and societal system that reinforces the total control of the master over the life of the enslaved. In ancient Rome, fear is the greatest tool of control. The system of slavery is not just about labor, it is about submission. It is about reminding the enslaved that they have no agency, no voice, and no future outside of their servitude. This system is supported by law, society, and culture, all of which are built to reinforce the idea that the enslaved are property, not people. Through legal codes, public displays of violence, and social norms that view slavery as a natural part of Roman life, the empire ensures that the enslaved remain in their place. They are not allowed to resist, to fight back, or to rise up. Their suffering is baked into the very fabric of Roman society, and their lives are deemed expendable for the greater good of the empire. The system of Roman slavery, while designed to be relentless and unyielding, was not impervious to cracks. Despite the overwhelming power of the Roman state, despite the legal structures that ensured the enslavement of millions, there were still moments when the enslaved attempted to assert some measure of control over their lives. It was a constant struggle, a battle not just for physical survival, but for the preservation of their humanity, in a world that saw them as tools, not people. Resistance in ancient Rome was not always loud, not always open. It was often silent, subtle, acts of defiance that, when discovered, could bring unimaginable punishment. Yet, for the enslaved, these small rebellions were acts of profound courage. They were an assertion of their identity, a refusal to be completely consumed by the empire's voracious hunger for labor. Perhaps it was a deliberate mistake in the work, a slight delay in service, a misstep that was designed to draw attention, however small. These acts might seem insignificant to the masters, but to the enslaved, they represented something more, a way to push back, even if only for a moment, to reclaim a piece of themselves in a world where every action was dictated by another's will. Some might engage in whisper networks, passing secret messages between one another, finding solace and strength in shared experiences. Others might sabotage the work they were forced to do, mild acts of insurrection that would be punished severely, but nevertheless embodied their resistance to being seen as nothing more than property. But the true cost of defiance was high. When the enslaved were caught rebelling, the punishment was swift and horrific. Crucifixion, the most infamous and public form of execution, was often the penalty for those who dared to escape or defy their masters. The condemned would be nailed to a cross, left to die slowly. An excruciating public spectacle meant to serve as a warning to others. In the Roman world, the body was not just a vessel, it was a symbol. And the punishment of the enslaved was designed to ensure that their bodies remained in a state of suffering for all to see. Crucifixion was reserved for the most heinous of crimes, and the mere attempt to escape slavery, whether by running away or even by speaking out, was enough to warrant this death sentence. It was a form of control that went beyond the physical, beyond the pain inflicted in the moment. It was a message. To disobey, to resist, to hope for something better, was to be erased. Even for those who did not die at the hands of their masters, the punishment was often severe. Branding, marking the body with a permanent symbol of their status as fugitives, was common for those who attempted escape. The Roman government saw branding as an effective tool of control, an eternal reminder of a person's place in the system. Another crushing aspect of Roman slavery was its ability to destroy families. The family unit was an essential part of life in Roman society, but for the enslaved, family ties were fragile and easily severed. Masters could sell children away from their parents, tear spouses apart, or separate siblings for the sake of profit or convenience. In many cases, the enslaved were denied any legal right to marry, and even if they formed family bonds, these were easily broken. The legal system viewed the enslaved as property, not as people capable of forming legal relationships. Thus, a husband could be sold away from his wife, a father separated from his children with little to no recourse. The psychological toll this took on the enslaved cannot be overstated. Not only were they forced to labor relentlessly, but they were also deprived of the most fundamental human experience, the ability to love and protect their own families. The emotional devastation of family separation was a form of control in itself. By removing the enslaved's ability to form lasting, independent relationships, the Roman state ensured that they would remain isolated, dependent, and broken. They were denied not only their freedom, but also the ability to form the bonds that made life worth living. The physical pain of slavery was one thing. The psychological toll was something else entirely. The enslaved, living in a constant state of fear, with no hope of escape, could lose their sense of self over time. The loss of identity was one of the most insidious aspects of slavery. These individuals were not allowed to define themselves. They were defined by others, by the empire, by their masters, by the laws that saw them as property. They were taught to believe that they were less than human. Their bodies were tools. Their desires were irrelevant. Their will was irrelevant. This dehumanization, this stripping away of their very identity, was perhaps the most enduring aspect of slavery in Rome. It wasn't just the back-breaking labor. It was the constant reminder that their lives were not their own. Their very existence was a commodity, a means to an end for the empire's expansion. For many, the desire to escape this fate, to regain a sense of agency, became a silent, internal struggle. But even small acts of rebellion, whether emotional, mental, or physical, were met with brutal retribution. The enslaved were, in many ways, trapped within their own minds as much as they were trapped by their chains. And yet, despite it all, the enslaved survived. They did not surrender their humanity entirely. Despite the crushing weight of Roman society's demands, they found ways to live, to resist, to dream. They resisted with their minds, with their small acts of defiance, with the hope that somehow, someday, they would be free. The desire for freedom, though impossible to attain for most, was the only thing that kept many going. But the empire, in its pursuit of power and control, made sure that freedom remained elusive. The enslaved were shackled not only in body, but in spirit. Their labor and their suffering became the foundation upon which Rome's power was built, and the empire could not afford to let them escape the cycle of control. Every empire that endures long enough learns the same lesson. Violence alone cannot hold power forever. Rome understood this better than any civilization before it. Its brutality was not chaos, it was codified. The whip, the brand, and the cross were not simply tools of punishment. They were the instruments of law. The Roman Empire built the most sophisticated legal system of the ancient world, and inside it, slavery wasn't a loophole, it was a cornerstone. In the Roman world, law was worshipped as the pinnacle of civilization. Senators boasted that even emperors were subject to it. But beneath this rhetoric lay an unspeakable truth. Roman law was designed to protect the master, not the enslaved. It was a machine calibrated to make suffering appear orderly. Every stage of an enslaved person's life, from birth to death, was governed by the cold logic of the legal code. A slave could not marry, own property, or even testify in court without torture. The word servus itself came from servare, to keep. It was a linguistic prison, a reminder that their purpose was not to live, but to be kept, maintained, and used. The Lex Fufia Caninia, 2 BCE, and Lex Aelia Sentia, 4 CE, supposedly offered rules about manumission, the freeing of slaves. But these laws weren't acts of mercy, they were mechanisms of control. By limiting how many enslaved people could be freed at once, Rome ensured that freedom would always remain a privilege, not a right. It kept the illusion of hope alive, a dream rationed by bureaucracy. Other laws, like the Senatus Consultum Celanianum, 10 CE, revealed Rome's true philosophy of control. If a master was murdered, every slave in the household could legally be executed, regardless of guilt. Collective punishment was state policy. Fear was justice. These laws transformed brutality into paperwork. Torture, for instance, was not considered cruelty. It was an investigative method. In Roman courts, the testimony of an enslaved person held no value unless extracted under torture. The idea was simple and horrifying. Only pain could produce truth. Imagine the scene: a small, dark chamber in a magistrate's house. The enslaved person is brought in, chained, trembling. A scribe sits nearby, ready to record the words that come between screams. To Rome, this was not barbarity. It was administration. Every lash, every burn, every torn tendon became part of the record. Pain, in the eyes of the law, was procedural. This is where the genius of Rome's cruelty lay. It made horror official. It stamped it with seals, filed it in archives, and justified it with precedent. By encoding violence into the language of governance, Rome could maintain an empire built on suffering without ever calling itself cruel. The enslaved were not people in the legal sense. They were assets. Their value fluctuated with age, skill, and obedience. A strong young man might fetch 1,200 denarii, a trained scribe 2,000. A woman in her childbearing years was both labor and investment. If she bore a child, the infant legally belonged to the master, another asset on the balance sheet. Manumission, the act of freeing a slave, was often less an act of kindness and more a fiscal maneuver. A master could free a loyal servant to appear generous, or to expand his network of dependents. Freedmen owed lifelong allegiance to their former masters. Their freedom was conditional, their gratitude mandatory. Even liberty had a price tag. Roman accountants recorded the depreciation of enslaved bodies the way merchants recorded livestock. When illness struck, their value fell. When scars accumulated, they became liabilities. And yet, this ledger of human flesh was not hidden. It was a point of pride. Rome's legal system prided itself on efficiency, and it treated human lives with the same cold calculus as grain or marble. To Rome, law was more than governance. It was divine order. The jurist Ulpian famously declared, "Justice is the constant and perpetual will to give each his due." But for the enslaved, his due meant obedience, silence, and submission. The empire had turned theology into bureaucracy. To defy one's master was not merely illegal, it was impious. Slavery became moralized as part of the natural hierarchy of the cosmos. Philosophers like Seneca and Aristotle argued that some men were born to rule and others to serve. The Stoics spoke of inner freedom while owning dozens of slaves. Even moral philosophy became complicit in maintaining the system. In Rome, ethics and law conspired to turn domination into destiny. This is the paradox at the heart of Roman greatness. The more orderly its laws became, the more efficiently it inflicted pain. The empire claimed to bring civitas, civilization, to the world, yet its order rested on the total dehumanization of millions. Roman law, admired for its rationality, concealed one of the most sophisticated systems of cruelty ever devised. When we study these codes today, we see the outlines of modern legality, the contracts, the property rights, the bureaucratic language that still defines justice. But within those same lines are echoes of screams from 2,000 years ago. The idea that law can be neutral, that administration can be moral, was born here, in the same offices where clerks tallied the worth of human lives. By turning suffering into legality, Rome achieved something that few empires ever have. It made cruelty invisible. The enslaved didn't just work under threat, they worked under law. Each punishment had precedent. Each mutilation had paperwork. It was a civilization where ethics ended and efficiency began. And yet, despite the centuries that separate us from Rome, its logic lingers. The idea that order justifies pain, that legality can cleanse violence, survives in every society that confuses law with morality. The question remains, when law itself becomes the instrument of domination, can justice still exist? Law can bind the body, but true power, the kind that lasts generations, binds the mind. Rome understood this. The empire didn't just enslave through chains or whips, it enslaved through belief, by reshaping what people thought they were worth. It built a system so vast, so normal, that even the enslaved began to question whether they deserved freedom at all. Every society that masters domination eventually learns this truth. Once you control how someone thinks, you no longer need to control how they move. In the Roman world, this was everywhere. From the moment of capture, the enslaved were stripped of their names, their languages, and their histories. A Thracian woman taken after a raid became Livia's maid. A Greek philosopher sold in the market became a scribe in chains. Their pasts were erased so thoroughly that, within a generation, their descendants no longer knew where they came from. To Rome, this erasure was not cruelty, it was order. The Senate called it Romanitas, the process of absorbing foreigners into the empire's culture. But, for the enslaved, it meant annihilation of the self. When your birth name is forbidden and your native gods are outlawed, you begin to vanish, piece by piece, until even your memories no longer belong to you. It was psychological warfare disguised as civilization. Over time, submission became instinct. The enslaved learned to lower their eyes, to silence their voices, to anticipate the moods of their masters before words were spoken. Disobedience was not just dangerous, it was suicidal. To survive, they had to perform obedience so perfectly that it almost became genuine. Roman writers like Cato and Varro encouraged masters to train slaves like animals, firmly, but without waste. The enslaved were to be conditioned, not merely punished. Whips were for correction. Deprivation was for education. A good slave didn't just obey. He believed obedience was right. Psychologists today would call this internalized control. Rome called it virtue. When the Stoic philosopher Seneca wrote letters about mercy and moral self-control, he did so while dozens of enslaved attendants stood silently in his villa. In his philosophy, freedom was a state of mind, not a legal status. The wise man, he wrote, even if chained, is free. It was the ultimate rationalization, the mental framework that allowed a moral empire to coexist with systemic cruelty. If freedom was spiritual, then bondage was merely circumstance. Rome had achieved the perfect paradox. It enslaved the body but preached the freedom of the soul. The enslaved lived within a theater of constant degradation. Everything around them reminded them of their inferiority. Clothing marked their status. Speech betrayed their origin. Even the scent of their labor, oil, smoke, sweat, became social stigma. At dinner parties, wealthy Romans would use enslaved attendants as ornaments. Some poured wine in silence. Others were forced to sing or play music. Their masters debated philosophy about virtue and justice, while servants stood barefoot, listening to their humanity reduced to intellectual play. In elite households, the cruelty could be refined. A host might command one of his enslaved men to recite poetry, then mock him for mispronouncing a line. Another might order his servant to kneel so guests could use his back as a footrest. There was no escape, because every gesture of subservience reaffirmed the system. Archaeology gives us glimpses of this world. In Pompeii, graffiti found near servant quarters depicts crude jokes, Romans mocking those who forget their place. One carving shows a man being whipped under the words, "Servus stultus, the fool who forgot he was owned." The humor was cruel, but its purpose was clear, to remind both master and slave that suffering was natural. Isolation was another instrument of psychological control. Enslaved people from different regions were deliberately mixed to prevent them from communicating or forming alliances. A Gaul, an Egyptian, and a Nubian might work side by side but share no language. Their shared silence became the empire's strongest defense. The Romans also weaponized hierarchy among the enslaved. Certain individuals, called vilici or overseers, were granted limited privileges to control others. These slave managers could whip their fellow captives, distribute rations, even report disobedience. They were enslaved themselves, yet part of the machinery that maintained the bondage of others. This was the genius of Roman domination. It made the enslaved complicit in their own control. Every lash came not only from above, but also from within. When the physical world offered no escape, many enslaved people turned to religion. Some clung to the gods of their homelands, whispering prayers to deities long forbidden in Roman temples. Others adopted the cults of Isis, Cybele, or Mithras, religions that promised spiritual equality beyond the grave. Archaeologists have uncovered small amulets and clay altars in slave quarters, tiny signs of faith hidden from the eyes of masters. One, found near Capua, bore the inscription, "The gods see the chains." Another, near Ostia, carried the words, "Even the bound are watched by heaven." Religion offered something Rome's law could not: dignity. A belief that even if the empire owned the flesh, the soul remained untouchable. In these secret rituals, the enslaved rediscovered what the empire had stolen: identity, connection, and hope. Yet, hope itself was dangerous. Masters feared it more than rebellion. To hope was to imagine a life beyond Rome's control, and imagination was the first step toward freedom. By the time an enslaved person reached adulthood, the damage was done. Their body might still function, their hands still obey, but their mind had been rewritten. They had been taught to believe the lie, that their worth came only from service. Rome's system of power didn't need to kill everyone. It only needed to convince them that resistance was impossible. In this way, slavery became self-sustaining. The law bound their bodies, the culture bound their roles, and the mind, their final frontier, bound itself. Rome's domination was total because it was invisible. It wasn't just the chains or the crosses, it was the silence that came after, the quiet acceptance of a world that called oppression order and obedience virtue. But even within that silence, there were cracks. The records of the enslaved who took their own lives rather than submit. The letters of masters complaining about unrest. The secret amulets buried beneath slave quarters. Each fragment tells us that not all minds were broken. Some endured, waiting for a moment that history would one day recognize. Because no empire can erase its crimes forever. The bones remember. The psyche remembers. And through those memories, the enslaved still speak. Every empire needs a system. Rome's genius was not in its armies, nor in its monuments, but in its ability to turn cruelty into routine. It didn't just dominate, it administered domination. From the palace to the plough, from the temples to the taverns, power flowed through channels as intricate and invisible as its aqueducts. Every drop of labor, every cry of pain had a place in the network. Rome's slavery was not chaos, it was logistics. The structure of slavery in the Roman Empire was staggering in its precision. By the 1st century CE, historians estimate that between 1 in every 3 people in Italy was enslaved. Across the provinces, the number swelled into the millions. But Rome didn't rule through constant violence. It ruled through predictable violence. There were rules, hierarchies, and schedules. The master gave orders. The overseer enforced them. The scribe recorded the output. The threat of punishment was always near, but it was so normalized that it no longer needed to be seen every day. Rome didn't need to kill everyone. It only needed to make examples. When a slave revolt erupted in Sicily or Capua, the empire's response was immediate and theatrical. Crucifixions lined the roads for miles, a forest of bodies serving as a living warning. Yet, once the executions ended, order returned. Life went on. Markets reopened. Masters purchased new labor. The message was simple. Rome forgives nothing, but forgets everything quickly enough to continue profiting from it. This was the balance that made Rome eternal. Its cruelty was not random. It was efficient. The Roman household, or domus, was more than a home. It was a microcosm of empire. Within its walls, every rank and rule of Rome was replicated. The master was emperor. His wife was priestess and accountant. The enslaved were citizens of a private kingdom, living under an unspoken constitution written in habit and fear. There were hierarchies even among the enslaved. The familia urbana, domestic slaves, served close to their masters and sometimes received better food, clothing, or education. The familia rustica, those in the countryside, faced relentless physical labor and isolation. Yet even among them, the system created internal divisions: cooks versus cleaners, field workers versus shepherds, men versus women. These divisions were deliberate. Rome understood that a divided familia could never unite against its master. Unity was dangerous. Hierarchy was safety. Each slave was given just enough privilege or just enough terror to keep them in line. The villicus, a slave appointed to oversee others, became both enforcer and victim. His whip kept others working, but his own survival depended on their obedience. Masters rarely needed to intervene. The system ruled itself. Control in Rome was psychological, but it was also economic. Fear was not just punishment, it was currency. Every act of cruelty bought compliance. Every small reward bought loyalty. Masters gave occasional privileges to a few: a loaf of fine bread, a cup of watered wine, a silver coin at the Saturnalia festival. These gestures cost little, but bought much. Gratitude became another form of bondage. The enslaved learned to equate survival with submission. This was Rome's silent genius. It replaced rebellion with dependence. It made slaves invested in the system that destroyed them. A loyal servant might dream of manumission, not revolution. Freedom, in the Roman sense, was not overthrowing power. It was being absorbed into it. Even freedom was just another method of control. Rome didn't rely on whips alone. It relied on gods. The empire's religion sanctified hierarchy. Every household had a shrine to the Lares, guardian spirits, and Penates, protectors of the home. Slaves prayed there alongside their masters, thanking the same spirits for their lives, their bread, and even their chains. The logic was simple. If the gods willed it, then obedience was holy. Temples across the empire depicted the emperor as Pontifex Maximus, chief priest, bridging the divine and the political. To serve one's master became an act of piety. The ritual of submission was not just social, it was sacred. Archaeological evidence from sites like Pompeii and Herculaneum shows domestic shrines decorated with both Roman and foreign deities. Isis beside Mercury, Serapis beside Jupiter. Masters allowed this fusion of faiths because it created spiritual anesthesia. Each slave believed their suffering was overseen by divine will. Every lash became a lesson, every death a purification. Religion turned the whip into liturgy. Rome's cruelty didn't just operate through law and religion, it was cultural theatre. The empire normalized suffering so thoroughly that the audience learned to applaud it. In the Colosseum, the crowd cheered as gladiators, many of them enslaved, fought to the death. In the mines, bodies broke in silence. Both acts served the same purpose: spectacle. The people of Rome consumed pain as entertainment, just as the empire consumed bodies as labor. Writers like Juvenal and Martial turned this into satire, mocking the enslaved even as they documented their agony. They joked about lazy servants, gluttonous cooks, and insolent maids, turning human misery into comedy. By laughing at the enslaved, Romans reaffirmed their superiority. Humor became propaganda. Even art conspired in this order. Mosaic floors depicted slaves carrying platters or sweeping floors, frozen forever in service. These weren't just decorations. They were reminders of hierarchy, visual sermons in marble. Behind every act of domination stood a clerk. Rome's control wasn't only ideological, it was administrative. Slaves were catalogued, taxed, insured, and inherited. In estates like those of the wealthy Seneca or Pliny, inventories listed not only livestock and grain, but names of human beings beside their appraised worth. A column might read, Felix, field laborer, 400 denarii. Tiro, scribe, 700 denarii. Athenias, maid, 250 denarii. Each line, neat and inked, was an act of violence disguised as accounting. This was how Rome industrialized slavery. It treated human life as data. The empire's size demanded order, and its order demanded dehumanization. Bureaucracy replaced the whip as the empire's most powerful weapon, cold, tireless, and eternal. Every empire tells itself the same story. We are not cruel, we are civilizing. Roman masters often imagined themselves as paternal figures, guiding their slaves with discipline and mercy. Philosophers like Seneca wrote essays advising moderation in punishment. A man should rule his slaves as he would his children. But this was hypocrisy dressed as virtue. Mercy in Rome was not kindness. It was a performance, a tool to preserve the illusion of morality while maintaining absolute control. When a master spared a servant, he didn't restore humanity. He reinforced hierarchy. You live because I choose. Even compassion became a transaction. By the height of the empire, the Roman system of slavery had become self-perpetuating. Violence no longer needed to shout. It whispered through laws, rituals, ledgers, and prayers. Control had evolved from chains to ideology, from punishment to paperwork. And the most frightening part was not the cruelty itself, but how ordinary it became. A senator could dictate a death sentence over breakfast, a priest could bless the lash, and a clerk could price a human life before lunch. Rome's secret wasn't that it was cruel. Every empire is cruel. Its secret was that it made cruelty look rational. The empire called them property. The law called them instruments. But the enslaved called themselves alive. For centuries, Rome's machine of control had ground down the human spirit into obedience. And yet, scattered across fields, mines, kitchens, and amphitheaters, there were moments, brief, desperate, incandescent, when the enslaved refused to vanish quietly into history. These were not rebellions born from hope. They were born from refusal, the last act of humanity in a world determined to erase it. The Roman elite feared only one thing, that those they ruled would realize how many they were. Across the empire, resistance took many shapes. A slave might steal food, not from hunger, but from pride. Another might whisper forbidden prayers or feign illness to stall the day's labor. These acts were small, invisible to the empire, but to the enslaved, they meant everything. Sometimes, resistance burned quietly for years before erupting. A broken chain hidden under a floorboard, a coded message carved into a wall, a whispered plan in the dark corners of a villa, and then, suddenly, the explosion. In 135 BCE, on the island of Sicily, a Syrian named Yunus claimed he could breathe fire. The enslaved followed him, believing his flames were divine. What began as a spark in a single estate became a war that engulfed the island. The First Servile War. For 2 years, tens of thousands of enslaved people held their ground against Roman legions. They crowned Yunus king and minted coins in his name. His army built their own walls, forged their own weapons, and even established a senate, a parody perhaps, of the very Rome that had condemned them. When the rebellion was crushed, Yunus was captured and executed. The survivors were crucified along the Sicilian roads, their bodies left to rot as a warning. But even in defeat, the message was clear. Rome's order was not divine, it could bleed. Decades later, in 73 BCE, another rebellion ignited. Not in the fields, but in the very heart of Rome's military machine. At a gladiator school in Capua, 74 enslaved fighters overpowered their guards with kitchen knives. Led by Spartacus, a former soldier from Thrace, they fled to the slopes of Mount Vesuvius. Their rebellion was not a riot, it was a revolution in embryo. At first, they were a handful of fugitives. Within months, they became an army of 70,000. Farmers, miners, shepherds, women, and children joined them, carrying makeshift weapons and stolen armor. For 2 years, they defeated every Roman force sent against them. They weren't merely escaping, they were undoing the empire. Ancient writers tried to frame Spartacus as a bandit, a brute. But even the hostile accounts admit something extraordinary. His army enforced discipline, freed captives, and refused to plunder the poor. They were not chaos, they were conscience. And that terrified Rome. The Senate unleashed the general Crassus, who eventually cornered the rebels in southern Italy. The final battle was carnage. Spartacus himself fell in combat, his body never found. In Rome's version of victory, 6,000 survivors were crucified along the Appian Way. A line of crosses stretching 200 kilometers, a road of bones connecting Capua to the gates of Rome. Rome called it justice. History calls it fear. After Spartacus, Rome never again faced a mass slave revolt. But the silence that followed was not peace. It was exhaustion. The empire had learned that rebellion could not be extinguished with blood alone. It needed to be rewritten, erased, reclassified as madness. Poets and historians reframed Spartacus as a monster, a warning, a mistake. His dream of freedom became a myth unfit for Roman memory. Even centuries later, the word servus still carried the echo of those crosses. But for those who lived through it, the nameless ones who buried their dead and returned to the fields, the idea could not be killed. Archaeologists have found graffiti scratched into the walls of a villa near Pompeii, believed to have been carved by a slave years after the rebellion. The road to Rome is paved with men who would not kneel. It is one of the few surviving testaments of defiance written not by a Roman, but by one of the enslaved. Even outside open revolt, resistance persisted in quieter forms. In the mines of Spain, slaves deliberately slowed production by dulling their tools. In North Africa, harvest yields mysteriously dropped after uprisings elsewhere. Perhaps coincidence, or perhaps sabotage, disguised as misfortune. In the kitchens of elite Roman homes, some slaves poisoned food, a weapon both intimate and invisible. Each act, though isolated, chipped away at the myth of Roman perfection. Every broken amphora, every burned granary, every vanished servant whispered the same truth. The empire's control was never absolute. And among the enslaved who survived long enough to buy or earn their freedom, rebellion took another form: memory. Freedmen who managed to enter Roman society often kept silent about their past, but their existence alone was defiance. They carried the knowledge of bondage into the spaces of power. Their children, citizens now, inherited both privilege and ghost. Rome's answer to rebellion was not only violence, it was amnesia. The empire learned to erase resistance as efficiently as it crushed it. Laws were passed forbidding gatherings of slaves. Plays and poems about Spartacus were censored. Public memory was re-engineered. The enslaved became invisible again, folded back into the mythology of empire. Monuments rose to generals, not rebels. Senators spoke of Rome's peace, not the price that bought it. The roads lined with crucifixions were cleared, the bodies removed, the story silenced. But archaeology has no loyalty to power. In the soil of Italy, archaeologists have uncovered coins minted by Spartacus's army, shackles hastily broken, and mass graves where soldiers and slaves lie side by side. The chronicles may have ended, but the ground remembers everything Rome tried to forget. Rebellion, at its core, was not about winning. It was about meaning. To rebel in Rome was to make a statement that the law could not comprehend, that suffering was not destiny and obedience was not virtue. The enslaved who rose against the empire knew they could not win. But by choosing death over submission, they redefined what freedom meant. Freedom was not survival. It was refusal. When Spartacus stood on the battlefield, surrounded by enemies, he knew he would not live to see victory. Yet, in that moment, the empire's logic broke. The enslaved man who refused to kneel was more free in death than any senator in Rome. That paradox haunted the empire forever. Rome believed it had extinguished rebellion, but in the end, rebellion had transformed into something immortal. Not an army, but an idea. Not a victory, but a memory. And memory, unlike empire, does not die. The empire that conquered the world understood one truth better than any other. Power must be seen to be believed. And in Rome, nothing was more visible than the suffering of the enslaved. From the grand marble arenas of the capital to the dusty amphitheatres of the provinces, Rome turned human agony into a national performance. It wasn't enough to own bodies. Those bodies had to perform obedience before the eyes of the free. This was how the empire taught its citizens what it meant to rule, and what it meant to be ruled. The Colosseum is often remembered as a monument to Roman engineering. But beneath the arches and marble seats, it was first and foremost a monument to control. At the height of its operation, it could hold nearly 50,000 people. Senators sat in the shade, the poor crowded under the sun. Yet for a few hours, every Roman, rich or poor, shared the same moral diet: spectacle. The morning began with executions. Enslaved criminals, rebels, or prisoners of war were paraded before the crowd. Some were forced to reenact myths. Orpheus torn apart by beasts, Prometheus chained and devoured. But these weren't plays. They were theatre turned literal, performed with real blood and real screams. To the Romans, it was justice disguised as myth. To the enslaved, it was annihilation disguised as art. After the executions came the animal hunts, thousands of exotic creatures shipped from Africa and the East. Lions, elephants, and leopards fought each other, then the enslaved, then the condemned. Every death was catalogued in the records as munera, duties. In Rome, slaughter was not chaos, it was a civic obligation. The afternoon belonged to the gladiators. Some were volunteers chasing fame, but most were enslaved men trained to die beautifully. The crowd cheered for blood, not out of cruelty alone, but out of complicity. Watching a man die for their amusement reminded them of their own safety, their own power. The spectacle worked because everyone believed they were on the right side of the sword. Rome called it entertainment. But it was ritualized obedience, a constant reenactment of empire's hierarchy, life and death, master and slave, citizen and property. Even outside the arenas, Rome used spectacle to govern. When a slave killed his master, the law demanded that every slave in the household be executed. In 61 CE, when a wealthy senator named Pedanius Secundus was murdered by one of his servants, 400 of his slaves were condemned to die. The Roman historian Tacitus describes the event with cold precision. The people protested, claiming the punishment was unjust, but the Senate voted to proceed. The executions were carried out publicly, in view of the city. It was not about guilt, it was about display. By turning punishment into performance, the empire transformed law into theatre. Every citizen who watched became an accomplice. Every scream became a warning. The enslaved learned to fear, and the free learned to accept. This was the unspoken contract of Rome: cruelty for the enslaved, comfort for the citizen, silence for all. The spectacle was not merely political, it was economic. The empire invested heavily in the logistics of death. Armies of enslaved workers maintained the arenas, built the cages, cleaned the blood, and buried the corpses. State accountants recorded expenses for animals, armor, and executioners. The Colosseum was not chaos, it was budgeted violence. Historians estimate that during the 100-day games of Emperor Trajan, over 9,000 animals and 5,000 humans were killed. Each corpse was a cost, each scream an investment in Rome's stability, and yet no one called it wasteful. To Rome, it was profitable. The games kept the populace docile and the merchants rich. Vendors sold food, wine, and souvenirs. Pain became a commodity, purchased, consumed, and discarded by the empire's citizens. Rome had built an economy where the currency was cruelty. But beyond profit, beyond politics, the spectacle served a deeper purpose. It was ritual. Every act of violence reaffirmed the divine hierarchy Rome believed in. The gods above the emperor above the citizens, and the citizens above the enslaved. To kill an enslaved person publicly was not simply punishment, it was worship. It reminded the audience that Rome's order was sacred, that disobedience was not just rebellion, but blasphemy. Even the staging of executions followed religious logic. Victims were dressed as mythic villains, minotaurs, titans, witches, and their deaths reenacted the triumph of order over chaos. The amphitheater was not only a stage, it was a temple of ideology. Each death purified the empire. Each drop of blood renewed its power. The true brilliance of Rome's spectacle was not its scale, it was its psychology. The crowd did not leave the arena horrified, they left reassured. They saw slaves burn, beasts roar, men die, and felt cleansed. They told themselves that the condemned were criminals, rebels, barbarians. They convinced themselves that the system was just, that their comfort was earned, and that the screams were deserved. This is how power sustains itself, not through force, but through consent. Rome's people learned to love the very cruelty that enslaved others. As long as pain was ritualized, it could be rationalized. Not all spectacles took place in public arenas. Many happened behind villa walls. In elite households, masters staged their own miniature performances. A servant who broke a dish might be whipped before guests to demonstrate authority. A concubine who disobeyed could be humiliated during banquets. These private acts mirrored the public games, smaller in scale, but identical in purpose, to make domination visible, to remind everyone in the room who was master and who was owned. Some masters even kept their own arenas, courtyards designed for punishment. In Pompeii, archaeologists discovered a villa with frescoes depicting bound slaves and instruments of torture. They were not warnings, they were decorations. The message was clear. Cruelty was not shameful, it was aesthetic. By the 2nd century CE, Rome's spectacles had become both grander and emptier. The crowd still roared, but the rituals had lost meaning. The empire was aging, and like a god grown senile, it killed now not to remind itself of order, but to remember that it was still alive. The enslaved continued to die for spectacle long after their deaths ceased to matter. Pain had become tradition, repeated because no one could imagine Rome without it. And that is perhaps the most haunting truth of all. When cruelty becomes culture, the spectacle never really ends. Every empire thinks it is eternal. Rome believed it could turn pain into order, bodies into wealth, and obedience into peace. For a while, it succeeded. But every transaction has a reckoning, and Rome's came slowly, measured not in coins or decrees, but in exhaustion. The same system that built its glory was hollowing it from within. On paper, slavery made Rome unstoppable. It provided the labor that fueled its agriculture, its mines, its armies, its temples, its baths. The enslaved harvested grain in Africa, quarried marble in Greece, and built roads through Gaul. They were the empire's invisible infrastructure, but the perfection of the system was also its flaw. Because slaves did everything, the free poor had nothing left to do. Across Italy, small farmers were swallowed by vast estates called latifundia. Plantations worked entirely by slaves. The countryside emptied. Freedmen drifted into cities, swelling the slums of Rome, dependent on state grain handouts. The more Rome conquered, the more slaves it acquired. The more slaves it acquired, the less work there was for its own citizens. The economy became a paradox: growth through conquest, collapse through success. By the 1st century CE, even senators complained that the empire had become addicted to expansion. When the frontiers slowed, so did the influx of new labor. The supply of slaves shrank, prices rose, and estates began to crumble under their own excess. The empire's wealth rested on a foundation that could not renew itself, a system that required endless conquest to feed its own appetite. Behind the balance sheets lay the unrecorded dead. Archaeologists estimate that the average lifespan of a mine slave in Spain or Sardinia was no more than 30 years. Most never reached adulthood. Those born into slavery rarely survived childhood. The tombs that do survive, small, anonymous, often without names, speak volumes through their silence. In the catacombs beneath Rome, skeletons show the deformities of endless labor. Twisted spines, shattered knees, broken teeth worn down from grinding grain. Some skulls bear the marks of shackles. In one Sardinian mine, hundreds of chained skeletons were found still standing, fused to the rock by centuries of rust. Each bone is a ledger entry in the empire's true account. But the cost was not only physical. For every life extinguished, something in Roman society died as well. Compassion, once a civic virtue, became weakness. The more the empire justified cruelty, the less it remembered what justice meant. Rome had conquered the world, but in doing so, it had enslaved its own conscience. By the 2nd century CE, Rome's elites no longer even pretended to see slavery as a moral issue. They called it natural. Philosophers like Aristotle and Cicero had planted the seed centuries earlier that some men were slaves by nature, instruments of the rational elite. This logic spread through law, religion, and custom until it became invisible, part of the air Rome breathed. Masters could host lectures on virtue while ordering floggings between courses. Senators could debate justice in the forum while their secretaries, enslaved Greek scholars, took notes. To live in Rome was to live inside a moral paradox, a civilization that built libraries, philosophies, and laws, all while pretending that the people who maintained them were less than human. It wasn't ignorance, it was willful blindness, engineered by comfort. The system had become too profitable to question. When cruelty is convenient, morality becomes decoration. And so, as Rome grew richer, it grew emptier. Slavery didn't just break bodies, it broke systems. Because slaves had no stake in the land, productivity declined once fear lost its edge. Masters, detached from labor, became dependent on overseers and middlemen. Corruption spread. When revolts flared up, the state responded not with reform, but with repression. By the 3rd century CE, the empire was drowning in its own contradictions. Free citizens unwilling to work, enslaved people unwilling to live, and emperors terrified of both. In response, the state tightened control. Laws began binding free peasants to the land, a precursor to medieval serfdom. The logic of slavery infected everyone. The empire that once enslaved the world now began enslaving itself. The system had come full circle. As centuries passed, Rome's reliance on human bondage left scars that outlived the empire itself. When it finally fell, its moral architecture remained. Medieval Europe inherited the same hierarchies, the same justifications, the same idea that power could sanctify suffering. In marble ruins and legal codes, the logic of Rome endured, that civilization is measured not by compassion, but by control. The modern world still echoes with this inheritance. Every time labor is treated as expendable, every time bureaucracy sanitizes cruelty, every time comfort demands silence, we hear Rome speaking through us. It whispers the same justification it once carved into law. This is the order of things. But bones, as always, refuse to stay silent. Today, archaeologists, historians, and forensic scientists are reopening the empire's ledgers. Excavations at Ostia, Pompeii, and Herculaneum have unearthed slave quarters beside opulent villas, revealing the proximity of luxury and misery. At sites in Gaul and Britain, isotopic analysis of bones shows enslaved children brought from foreign lands, proof that Rome's reach was not only military, but human. On a villa wall near the Bay of Naples, a single inscription, scratched in charcoal, survived the eruption of Vesuvius. We worked until we could not stand. The gods did not see us. We see each other. It is not in any Roman chronicle. It is the voice the empire tried to erase, and the voice that endures. Because in the end, history is not written by the victors. It is written by what refuses to disappear. The cost of Rome's power cannot be measured in gold, marble, or conquests. It must be measured in the lives spent to sustain it, in the humanity stripped from those who built its greatness. Every aqueduct, every temple, every road carried the weight of a human life. The empire called it civilization. The bones call it what it truly was, a transaction of flesh for glory. Rome's achievements were vast, but so was its silence. And when its cities finally fell, it wasn't barbarian swords that ended it. It was moral exhaustion. An empire that no longer believed in mercy had nothing left to protect it. The ledgers are closed now. The columns of profit and pain have turned to dust. But if we listen closely, in the ruins, in the archives, in the bones, we can still hear the faint echo of the question that Rome could never answer. How long can power survive when its foundation is cruelty? Rome's empire crumbled, its marble walls and towering columns reduced to dust and ruin. But what remains, what endures, are the ideologies it created. The empire's most enduring legacy is not found in its conquests or its architecture. It is found in the system it left behind, a framework of control that reached far beyond the borders of the empire. Rome's system of enslavement did not die with the empire. It was inherited, adapted, and refined. Across Europe, Africa, and the Near East, the principles of Roman dominance became the foundation for centuries of human suffering. The empire's greatest triumph was its ability to normalize cruelty, to make exploitation a natural part of society. And in the centuries that followed, the legacy of Rome's dehumanization stretched its fingers into new worlds, from feudal Europe to the transatlantic slave trade. When the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 CE, the political structure may have disappeared, but the social and economic systems remained. The Roman idea of manus, a legal concept that granted masters absolute control over their slaves, was adapted by medieval feudal lords who established their own form of servitude, serfdom. In feudal Europe, the vast landholdings of kings and lords were worked by peasants bound to the land. They were not enslaved in the strict Roman sense, but they were legally restricted from leaving the land they worked. They could not own property, they could not marry without their lord's consent, and they were forced to give a portion of their crops as rent. Though serfs were not owned like Roman slaves, they were still subject to many of the same dynamics of domination. The feudal system was a direct descendant of Roman social structures. Power was centralized in the hands of the few, and the labor of the many was extracted through threats of violence, legal coercion, and systemic inequality. The fundamental belief that some people were born to serve and others to rule, central to Roman slavery, remained embedded in medieval European society. The concept of the unfree laborer that Rome created was not only revived, but became entrenched in new social structures that lasted for centuries. The legacy of Roman slavery would eventually cross oceans, leaving a mark on the new world that would last for centuries. The transatlantic slave trade, which spanned from the 16th to the 19th centuries, mirrored Rome's own economic dependence on enslaved bodies. Just as Rome had built its empire on the backs of enslaved peoples from across Europe, Africa, and Asia, the European colonial powers built their empires on the systematic capture, transportation, and exploitation of African people. The mechanisms of enslavement, ranging from capture, branding, and sale to brutal labor on plantations, were hauntingly similar to Roman practices. Roman legacies persisted in the language of slavery, the classification of people as property, the practice of dehumanizing enslaved individuals by removing their names and cultures, and the institutionalized violence that justified their treatment. During the peak of the transatlantic slave trade, over 12 million Africans were forcibly transported to the Americas. As Rome's empire relied on conquest to expand its labor pool, the European colonizers turned the Atlantic into their own marketplace, commodifying human beings for the sake of wealth and power. In the colonies, enslaved people worked the same crops that Roman slaves once harvested: sugar, tobacco, cotton, and rice. These crops didn't just fuel the economic engine of empires, they sustained it. The economic structures that emerged in the Americas were directly influenced by Roman models of slavery, where the value of human life was calculated in the same way that livestock or goods were. In both ancient Rome and the New World, enslaved people were justified as less than human, natural inferiors, whose status could not be questioned. While Roman slavery was largely rooted in conquest and war, the transatlantic slave trade introduced a racial dimension to the practice. Roman slavery, based on class and conquest, was not explicitly racial. Enslaved people came from every part of the empire and every race. However, by the time of the transatlantic slave trade, racial categories were invented and institutionalized to maintain a social order that made the enslavement of African people seem natural. In the context of colonialism, enslaved Africans were increasingly depicted as racially and inherently inferior. This racialization of slavery, the idea that some races were naturally suited to serve, was an ideological development that could trace its roots directly back to Roman thinking. Roman slavery had normalized the idea that certain groups were fit to serve while others were fit to rule. That idea was reimagined in the Americas, where the inferiority of African slaves was justified not by legal codes or military conquest, but by pseudo-scientific racism. Just as Roman philosophy justified slavery as natural, European thinkers like Aristotle and later Enlightenment philosophers adopted similar views. Slavery, in their eyes, was a natural part of society, an extension of the order of things. It was an idea that sustained both ancient Rome and the modern world. Rome's legacy of dehumanization was not only economic and social, it was deeply psychological. Centuries of violence and suppression led to a widespread amnesia about the victims. When the Roman Empire fell, history was rewritten, but the enslaved people, whose labor had built Rome's glory, remained faceless. The struggle for recognition, whether in ancient Rome, medieval Europe, or the American South, was not just about survival. It was about forcing history to acknowledge the humanity of those who had been erased. The fight for freedom did not end with the fall of Rome. It echoed through the centuries in the cries of enslaved people who had been silenced, and whose stories remained untold until they were reclaimed by the generations that followed. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the descendants of enslaved people fought to retell their own stories, whether through civil rights movements, reparations campaigns, or academic work uncovering the history of slavery. These efforts were, in many ways, a rejection of the silence imposed by Roman law and modern racial ideologies. The legacy of Roman slavery continues to affect the world today. The same systems of inequality, economic exploitation, and racialization that began in Rome are still visible in modern societies. The logic of domination, whether through legal systems, economic inequality, or racial discrimination, remains an unbroken chain connecting the ancient world to the present. Roman law gave birth to the concepts of private property, legal ownership, and inequality that still define much of modern capitalism. In the United States, the Constitution itself contained compromises over slavery, and the economic systems that arose from slavery shaped the financial architecture of the modern world. By tracing these legacies back to their Roman roots, we see that the struggles against slavery and exploitation are part of a much longer, much older fight for human dignity. The bones buried beneath the soil are not the only things that speak. For centuries, the voices of the enslaved were erased, their lives reduced to statistics, their suffering dismissed as an inevitability of empire. But the remnants they left behind, their broken chains, their hastily carved inscriptions, the relics of their lives, are finally being heard. The silence is breaking. We are only now beginning to recover the voices of those who were never allowed to speak. The enslaved did not simply suffer. They resisted. They survived. They left their mark. And today, those marks are being found, scattered across the world, in archives, on excavation sites, in the smallest shards of pottery and stone. The question, however, is not just one of archaeology. It is one of recognition. Who will listen to these voices? Will we understand the weight of what they have to say? Archaeology has become the most powerful tool in resurrecting the lives of the enslaved. Excavations across the former empire have uncovered evidence of rebellion, survival, and hidden defiance, the footprints of resistance that have been buried for centuries. In Rome, where the ancient world is literally built on layers of stone, archaeologists have uncovered traces of enslaved people living in close proximity to their masters. Inside villas, they find evidence of secret rooms where enslaved people could hide, or remnants of tools used in acts of sabotage, items deliberately broken to slow down work. In some cases, even the arrangement of buildings and objects hints at the subtle resistance of those who lived there. In Pompeii, one of the most famous archaeological sites, the remains of enslaved people have been uncovered alongside the opulent artifacts of Roman elites. Frescoes from villas show slaves living under constant surveillance. But small, hidden messages scratched on walls show they sought freedom in their own ways. Names, coded messages, and symbols, each a silent scream against their circumstances. The images of slaves carrying heavy loads are juxtaposed with images of the empire's splendor, reminding us of the crushing disparity between the two. In places like Herculaneum, where the eruption of Mount Vesuvius preserved a snapshot of daily life, the remains of the enslaved can be seen, some with signs of violent deaths, others with signs of resistance. Broken bodies that tell a story not just of suffering, but of struggle. When archaeologists uncovered the bones of the enslaved, they did not just find relics of death, they found remnants of life. Inscriptions, often dismissed as trivial, have proven to be some of the most profound forms of resistance among the enslaved. Graffiti, scratched into walls or carved into stone, were ways of marking presence and demanding recognition. These writings were not just expressions of defiance, they were acts of survival. At a site in Ostia, Rome's port city, graffiti was found on the walls of buildings used by the enslaved, including names, dates, and references to the gods of Egypt and other lands, showing that many enslaved people maintained their identities in ways the empire could not erase. These inscriptions, written in the margins of empire, were declarations of existence, simple and profound. I was here. In Pompeii, another poignant piece of graffiti was found near the gladiatorial training ground. It read, "A gladiator's body belongs to the arena, but his soul belongs to the gods." This was not a slave's resignation to his fate. It was a declaration of autonomy in the face of dehumanization. It spoke of the internal resistance that, for all of Rome's laws, could not be crushed by force. It was the enslaved's way of saying, "We are here, and we are human." While archaeology plays a pivotal role, modern scholarship has also contributed significantly to reclaiming the voices of the enslaved. Scholars have begun re-examining ancient texts, interpreting them not just as reflections of Roman grandeur, but as evidence of the power structures that oppressed millions. Historians are combing through Roman legal documents, letters, and contracts, revealing the cold precision with which enslaved people were commodified. But they're also uncovering the stories hidden within these texts, the small victories, the everyday moments of resistance, and the quiet rebellions of individuals who managed to escape, if only for a moment, the overwhelming machinery of the empire. In cities like Rome, Athens, and Carthage, scholars are piecing together the lives of the enslaved using a mix of archaeology, ancient records, and comparative studies. They are uncovering burial sites where the enslaved were interred without ceremony, alongside their masters. Yet, their presence is now felt, as historians resurrect their forgotten stories. While much has been uncovered from the ancient past, we must not forget that the enslaved never stopped speaking. From freedom fighters in the American South to abolitionists in 19th century Europe, the descendants of those who lived and died under Rome's system of slavery have continued to fight for recognition. The modern civil rights movements, which trace their roots back to earlier struggles, echo the demands for justice and memory that began long ago. Writings from enslaved people in the Americas, such as those by Frederick Douglass or Sojourner Truth, show that the voices of the enslaved were never silenced. They were just pushed into the margins of history. The power of resistance that began with Spartacus, continued through the abolition of slavery, and lives on in modern movements, is part of the same story. Every time a descendant of the enslaved speaks, whether in protest, in art, or in literature, they are breaking the silence that was imposed by the empire. Their voices are the final, irreversible triumph over the system that sought to erase them. But even now, the struggle continues. Institutionalized racism, economic disparity, and cultural erasure still haunt the descendants of those enslaved by the Roman Empire. Though the empire is gone, its effects linger. The fight for recognition and justice is far from over. As the world moves further into the 21st century, there is a growing movement to address the long-lasting impacts of slavery. The modern Black Lives Matter movement, the push for reparations, and the increasing number of global museums dedicated to slavery and human rights are all part of a broader effort to undo the erasure that has lasted for centuries. The voices of the enslaved have been silenced, but their legacy is now being remembered. The stories of their lives, their suffering, and their resistance have found new platforms, and the bones of the past still have much to teach us. Empires fall, stones crack, statues fade, but ideas, especially the dangerous ones, endure. Rome may be dust, but its logic still runs through our institutions, our economies, our hierarchies. The empire's real monument isn't the Colosseum or the Forum. It's the belief that power can justify anything if it calls itself civilization. We are still living inside Rome's shadow. The same rationale that built Rome's slave economy continues to shape modern systems of labor and inequality. The faces have changed, but the structure remains. A few command, many obey, and the world calls it progress. Every global supply chain that hides exploitation behind efficiency, every corporation that reduces workers to data points, every state that values productivity over humanity, they all echo the Roman idea that order is more important than compassion. Rome taught us how to build systems that run on human lives, and how to look away while they do. Modern slavery still exists in factories, farms, and mines. The people who stitch our clothes, harvest our food, and dig for the metals in our phones live under conditions the Romans would recognize: unpaid, unseen, expendable. Their suffering, like that of the enslaved in antiquity, is justified by the same phrase, necessity. We may not call it empire anymore, but the logic hasn't changed. Every generation invents its own Rome, a symbol of power, law, and civilization. But few remember what the empire cost to sustain. We quote Cicero, we study Roman architecture, we praise its governance, but we rarely ask, governance for whom? The roads we admire were paved by enslaved hands. The philosophy we celebrate was written in houses built by chained labor. The law we inherit was drafted to make domination legal. To forget this is to participate in the same moral blindness that allowed Rome to exist. The Romans didn't think of themselves as cruel. They thought of themselves as organized. That is the most dangerous lesson Rome ever taught. That cruelty, if administered efficiently enough, can be mistaken for order. And when we repeat that mistake, when we measure civilization by control instead of compassion, we pay Rome's price again. The question Rome leaves us is not just historical, it's existential. Can civilization exist without domination? Rome believed the answer was no. Its philosophers argued that hierarchy was natural, that justice meant giving each his due, even when that due was bondage. But the enslaved, by surviving, offered another philosophy. Their lives, their defiance, their endurance were a quiet rejection of that logic. They proved that dignity can exist without power, and that morality begins where hierarchy ends. Modern societies still struggle with this truth. We speak of equality, yet tolerate systems that depend on hidden suffering. We preach human rights while consuming the fruits of exploitation. Rome is gone, but its contradictions remain alive in us. The moral reckoning Rome demands is not about guilt, it's about recognition. To study Rome's cruelty is not to condemn the past, it is to understand how much of that past still defines the present. History, when done honestly, is an act of resurrection. To name the enslaved, to reconstruct their lives, to expose their suffering, is to return what empire tried to erase, their humanity. Every inscription decoded, every bone analyzed, every excavation that reveals a human story restores a fragment of justice. The work of archaeologists, historians, and artists today is not just academic, it is moral. They are rewriting the record Rome left incomplete. And in doing so, they remind us that memory itself is resistance. In 2024, a team excavating near Ostia uncovered a communal grave of enslaved workers who had died during the construction of the harbour. They were buried without tombstones, their names lost. But nearby, a small shard of pottery was found with a scratched message. We were many, and we were never nothing. It is not Latin, it is Greek, the language of the conquered, the language of half of Rome's slaves. And it carries across 2,000 years the defiant truth that no empire can fully erase the people who built it. The legacy of Roman slavery is not only a warning, it is a debt. We owe something to those whose silence built our civilization. Their suffering financed the laws, art, and institutions we still admire. Acknowledging that debt does not mean rejecting Rome's achievements, it means measuring them honestly. Every triumphal arch must be weighed against the backs that lifted its stones. Every line of poetry written in marble villas must be read alongside the voices silenced outside their walls. Civilization's brilliance means nothing if it blinds itself to the cost of its light. That is the price of legacy. To remember that the foundation of progress has always been built on lives deemed expendable, and to ensure that history does not repeat that calculus under new names. Rome's empire collapsed, but its ledger remains open. Its debts, moral, historical, and human, can never be repaid, only acknowledged. We read its laws and see our own reflected. We walk its ruins and feel the silence pressing against us. we study its order, and realize how easily reason becomes rationalization. And yet, there is hope in the act of remembering. Every time we confront the truth of Rome's cruelty, we loosen the chains it left behind. Every time we name those the empire erased, we undo its greatest triumph, its erasure of empathy. Because history is not a mirror, it's a reckoning. And the question Rome leaves us is not how it fell, but whether we will fall the same way. When law becomes ledger, when mercy becomes luxury, when power becomes its own justification, that is when every civilization begins to hear the sound of its own collapse. If you value the record, remember the voices. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak.